At 2:47 in the afternoon on June 19, 1943, a 24-year-old German prisoner named Hans Weber stood barefoot in the sand at Kingsley Lake, Florida, watching an American corporal named Matthews kick off his boots and wade into the water beside him. Weber had been captured 6 weeks earlier outside Tunis. His Panzer regiment had run out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. He had crossed the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, expecting concrete cells, interrogation rooms. The starvation and torture that Goebbels had promised would await any German who fell into American hands. Instead, he was being told to go swimming. 3 American guards, 12 German prisoners of war. No handcuffs, no chains, just warm water, a blue sky, and the impossible quiet sound of enemies laughing in the same water at the same time. Weber didn't understand it. He couldn't understand it. Somewhere across the ocean, his father was still alive in Munich, though he wouldn't be for much longer. Somewhere in Poland, camps he had refused to believe existed were still operating at full capacity. And here, in a country he had been taught to hate, an American soldier whose grandfather had once been German was handing him a Lucky Strike cigarette and asking in perfect Bavarian where he was from. This is the true story of what happened next, and why Klaus Weber would carry a single photograph from that afternoon in his desk drawer for the next 44 years, until the day he died. May 13, 1943. The Tunisian sun hammered the desert like a blacksmith's fist, and Panzer Regiment 5 was dying by inches. Hans Weber sat with his back against the burning steel of a Panzerforte that would never move again. 24 years old, born in Munich, spring of 1919, in a hospital that still smelled of the last war. He watched the fuel gauge that had read empty for 6 hours. He watched the ammunition counter, 0. He watched his hands, black with oil and dust and something that might have been blood. And he understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that the war was over for him. Around him, the veterans of the 21st Panzer Division stood up one by one. They laid their rifles in the sand. They raised their palms toward the sky. And the men of the British 4th Infantry Division came walking through the heat mirage like ghosts in khaki, rifles level, faces unreadable. A British sergeant with sunburned cheeks looked Weber in the eye. He did not smile, he did not sneer. He simply nodded the way a man nods to another man at a funeral. That single nod would haunt Weber for 44 years, 9 days at a collection point near Mater, 9 days of sleeping on stones, 9 days of watching flies feast on the eyes of horses that had died in the retreat. Weber prayed for water. He prayed for shade. He did not pray for home, because home, according to the radio, no longer existed the way he remembered it. Then came the ship. They marched the prisoners up the gangway of a Liberty ship at Oran, 17 days of Atlantic crossing, waiting like a coffin lid above them. 800 German soldiers packed into a hold designed for cargo. The air tasted of diesel and vomit and unwashed men. Weber lay in a hammock strung between 2 iron pipes and listened to the ocean grind against the hull. And he thought about the propaganda officer who had lectured them back in France about what the Americans did to prisoners. "They will starve you," the officer had said. "They will beat you until your teeth fall from your skull. They will chain you in concrete cells and feed you the meat of dogs. Better to die on the battlefield, boys. Better a bullet than the American cage." Weber had believed him. Every man in that hold had believed him. 17 days. He lost 14 pounds. On June 9, 1943, the Liberty ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia. Weber climbed onto the deck expecting to be shot. Instead, he saw dock workers eating sandwiches. He saw a woman in a yellow dress laughing beside a black automobile. He saw a bakery truck rolling past the pier with the words "fresh" painted on its side in cheerful red letters. And he understood in that moment that he had come to a country that did not know it was at war. They loaded him onto a train. Wooden benches, open windows. The American countryside unrolled outside the glass like a film reel from another planet. Green fields that had never been shelled, white houses with porches that had never burned, cattle that had never been eaten by starving soldiers. The train rolled south for 2 days, Georgia, then Florida. The air grew thick and sweet, heavy with the smell of orange blossoms and pine sap. On June 11, 1943, the train hissed to a stop at a place called Camp Blanding, near the town of Stark. This is where Weber expected to die. The guards marched them through a gate. Weber walked with his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, the way a German soldier was taught to walk toward his execution. He rehearsed his last words. He thought of his mother, Anna, in her kitchen in Munich, humming while she peeled potatoes. He thought of the crucifix above her bed. He was ready. Then he saw the barracks, wooden, painted white, screen doors that hissed softly in the Florida breeze, windows, actual glass windows, unbroken, catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back in golden squares. A baseball diamond scratched into the red dirt beyond the fence. A radio somewhere, Bing Crosby's voice drifting through the pines, singing, "I'll be seeing you." Weber stopped walking. A guard prodded him gently, almost apologetically, with the barrel of a rifle. "Move along, son." They led him to the mess hall. And here, dear listener, is where the world Weber had been taught to fear began to crumble like sugar in warm water. On the tray they handed him, beef stew, thick with carrots and onions, steaming. A wedge of white bread, soft as a pillow, canned peaches, golden and sweet, swimming in their own syrup, and coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted acorn sludge he had been drinking in North Africa for 6 months. Real, black American coffee, hot enough to burn his lip. Weber sat down at a long wooden table. He looked at the tray. He looked at the other prisoners, some of whom were already eating, tears sliding silently down their cheeks. He looked at the American guard, leaning against the wall, chewing a toothpick, reading a comic book. He lifted the spoon. The first bite of beef stew was more meat than Weber had eaten in the final 6 months of the North African campaign. He did not weep. He was too proud to weep, but his hands shook so badly that stew dripped onto the table. And a young German soldier across from him, a boy of maybe 19, whispered, "Ist das ein Traum? Is this a dream?" Weber did not answer. He did not know how. That evening, Feldwebel Hoffmann, a thick-shouldered veteran who had been in the camp since January, gathered the new arrivals in the shade of the barracks. He held up a folded pamphlet. "Listen carefully," Hoffmann said in German, "because your officers lied to you. This is the Geneva Convention of 1929. The Americans follow it. They will pay you 80 cents a day for your labor. Not in dollars, but in canteen script, which you can spend at the camp store on cigarettes, on razors, on chocolate. You will work 8 hours a day, no more. You will not be beaten. You will not be starved. If you obey the rules, you will survive this war." Someone in the back laughed bitterly. "And if we don't obey?" Hoffmann shrugged. "Then you go without the chocolate." 3 days later, on June 14, they loaded Weber into the back of a canvas-covered truck and drove him 30 miles north to a citrus grove outside Leesburg. The foreman was a Floridian named Patterson, 50-something, with a face like weathered leather and a slow, unhurried way of speaking. He walked Weber down a row of orange trees heavy with fruit, showed him how to twist the orange from the stem without bruising the skin, how to fill a wooden crate, how to stack the crates in the shade of the wagon. The quota was 30 crates a day. Patterson said this without menace, the way a father tells a son to mow the lawn. Weber worked. The sun climbed. His back ached. The scent of citrus filled his lungs, sharp and clean and utterly foreign to a man raised on the smell of Bavarian pine. At noon, a bell rang somewhere, and the prisoners sat down beneath the trees to eat their lunch. Sandwiches, wrapped in wax wrapper, a bottle of Coca-Cola, sweating cold in the heat. Weber unwrapped his sandwich slowly, as if it might explode. That was when he saw the American walking toward him. Young, maybe 23. Corporal stripes on his sleeve, a Garand rifle slung casually over his shoulder, the way you sling a fishing rod. He was smiling. He had a pack of Lucky Strikes in his hand. He crouched down beside Weber, shook one cigarette loose, offered it. Weber stared at the cigarette. He had not smoked an American cigarette in his life. He had been told they were poisoned, laced with chemicals to weaken German soldiers. He had been told 100 things, and every single one had turned out to be a lie. He took the cigarette. The American struck a match, cupped it against the breeze, held the flame steady. And then, in a soft, unmistakable Bavarian accent, the American said, "Grüß Gott. Ich heiße Matthews." Greetings from God. My name is Matthews. Weber's hand froze halfway to his lips. The cigarette trembled. He looked at the American's face, really looked, and saw the broad Bavarian cheekbones, the pale blue eyes that could have belonged to any farmer in the villages outside Munich. Matthews smiled, took a drag from his own cigarette, and explained, in German cleaner than most of Weber's Prussian comrades could manage. "My grandfather came over in 1912, left Bavaria to escape the Kaiser's draft, settled in Pennsylvania, never went back, But he taught my father the language, and my father taught me. So here I am, corporal in the United States Army, guarding my own cousins in an orange grove in Florida." Weber could not speak. He drew smoke into his lungs. It tasted of tobacco and sunlight, and something that felt absurdly like coming home. Matthews clapped him gently on the shoulder. Then he stood, tipped his cap, and walked back to his post beneath the trees. Weber sat in the red Florida dirt, holding a burning American cigarette, listening to a mockingbird singing in a language older than every war ever fought. And he understood for the first time in his life that everything he had been told about the enemy was a lie. Everything. By the end of that first week, Weber had learned the rhythm of the orange grove the way a soldier learns the rhythm of the march. Twist the fruit. Drop it in the sack strung across his shoulder. Move 3 steps down the row. Twist. Drop. Empty move. His hands blistered, his hands bled, his hands calloused. And by the second week of that Florida June, Hans Weber, Panzer Grenadier of the 21st Division, veteran of El Alamein and Kasserine and 100 smaller hells, could fill 30 crates of oranges by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour before quitting time, and lie back in the shade with a Coca-Cola sweating in his hand while the Florida sun spilled through the leaves like melted gold. It was here, lying in the dirt beneath a citrus tree, that Weber began to study his captors. He noticed the guard named Wilkins first. A tall man, perhaps 48, walked with a limp so faint you had to watch for it. Wilkins had been in France in 1918, had taken shrapnel at Below Wood, had come home to Georgia and raised chickens for 20 years before the Second War pulled him back into uniform. He was too old for the fighting in Europe, so they gave him a rifle and a whistle and told him to watch Germans pick oranges. Then there was Corporal Hendricks, 26, but with the eyes of a man twice that age. Hendricks had been on Guadalcanal. Something had happened there. He never spoke of it, but sometimes, when a truck backfired on the road beyond the fence, Hendricks would drop to one knee and press his forehead against the stock of his rifle, breathing hard, whispering words no one could hear. The other guards would look away and pretend they had not seen. And there were the young ones. Boys, really. Boys who had lost a foot in Sicily. Boys who had lost a hand in North Africa. Boys who had come home from the war missing pieces of themselves. And the army, not knowing what else to do with them, had sent them to Florida to guard the men who had wounded them. Weber understood slowly that his captors were not fresh troops. They were survivors, every one of them. Guarding prisoners was not punishment. It was a reward, the reward of being allowed to live. June 19, 1943. A Saturday. The trucks rumbled into camp at dawn and Feldwebel Hoffman announced, in a voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever, that 12 prisoners had been chosen for a special detail. Weber's name was on the list. He climbed into the truck expecting the worst. The worst, he had learned, was a habit hard to break. They drove for 40 minutes through pine forest, so thick the sky was cut into blue ribbons above their heads. Then, without warning, the trees opened, and Weber saw water, a lake, enormous, round as a silver coin dropped into the green Florida earth. Kingsley Lake. Later, in the mythology of the German POWs, some men would call it Lake Geneva, as if the very ground had signed the treaty. But its true name was Kingsley, and its water was so clear you could see the white sand bottom 15 feet down. The truck stopped. 3 American guards climbed out. Matthews was among them. And then Matthews did something Weber would remember exactly for the rest of his life. He sat down in the grass. He unlaced his combat boots. He pulled off his socks. He shrugged out of his uniform blouse and stood there in his olive-drab undershirt, a Bavarian-blooded American corporal of the United States Army. He looked at the 12 German prisoners and he said in that soft, unhurried Bavarian German, "The water is warm. Come on." For a long moment, no one moved. Weber looked at Hoffman. Hoffman looked at the American guards. The American guards had already set their rifles against a pine tree and were unbuttoning their trousers. And then, slowly, like men waking from a dream they were afraid to end, the German prisoners undressed. Weber walked to the shore. The sand was warm beneath his bare feet. He waded in up to his knees, then his waist, then his chest, and finally he pushed off and let the water take him. He floated on his back. He stared up at the Florida sky, that impossible blue, and he listened to men laughing. Germans laughing. Americans laughing. Laughing at the same joke, though Weber could not remember afterward what the joke had been. For 30 minutes, in the middle of the Second World War, 3 American soldiers and 12 German prisoners shared the water of a Florida lake. No fences, no rifles. Nothing between them but sunlight and the slow ripple of a warm freshwater wave. When Weber climbed out and lay on the grass to dry, he watched a dragonfly land on the barrel of Matthews's rifle. And he thought, "If I tell my mother about this, she will not believe me." That night, back in the barracks, he sat down with a stub of pencil and a sheet of paper stamped with the Red Cross seal, and he wrote to Anna Weber in Munich. "Mama," he wrote, "today I went swimming with the enemy. The water was warm, the sun was kind. Please believe me." He did not know if the letter would ever reach her. He knew the American censors would let it pass. He suspected his mother would think he had lost his mind. He mailed it anyway. August of 1943. The war in Europe was turning. Weber could feel it in the newsreels, in the newspapers the guards left lying around, in the way certain Feldwebels stopped clicking their heels quite so smartly. They transferred him, along with 60 other prisoners, to a work detail near a town called Winter Haven. There, on a red dirt lot bordered by orange groves as far as the eye could see, the Americans were building a citrus canning plant. It would pack the juice and segments of the Florida orange into tin cans and ship them to soldiers all over the world. Weber learned to pour concrete. He learned to mix it in a great growling drum, to trowel it flat, to feel with his palm when the surface had set enough to walk on. He learned to lay copper pipe. He learned to solder joints with a hissing blue torch. He learned to read blueprints, though the words were in English and he had to guess at half of them. He did not know then that these skills, learned under a Florida sun, with a Coca-Cola never more than an hour away, would one day pull him out of the ruins of Munich. He did not know that the man he was becoming, this Weber who could build a wall and pour a foundation and read a pipe schematic, would be the man his family needed in 1948. He only knew that his back grew strong, his hands grew wise, and the number on the scale in the mess hall crept upward, week by week. 140 pounds when he had arrived, 148 by August, 155 by October, 162 by the end of the year. Some nights he watched movies in the rec hall. A projector clacked against a bedsheet nailed to the wall. He saw Stagecoach, John Wayne riding through Monument Valley with a rifle across his knees, and Weber found himself absurdly rooting for the American cowboy. He laughed with the other prisoners at the jokes he did not fully understand. He ate popcorn from a paper bag, and it tasted, he thought, like the American century itself. News trickled in. September 8, 1943. Italy surrendered. Hoffman announced it in the barracks, his voice flat, his eyes dark. Someone spat, someone cursed the Italians. Someone else said nothing at all. Weber walked outside and stood beneath a Florida moon, so bright it cast shadows. He pulled from his pocket a folded map, torn from a magazine, and he studied the lines and arrows a war correspondent had drawn upon it. Kursk had fallen in July, the Russians were advancing, the Americans and British were landing in Sicily and pushing north. He counted divisions in his head, he counted fuel reserves. He counted the miles from Warsaw to Berlin. And Hans Weber, 24 years old, a Bavarian farmer's grandson who had once believed in the 1,000-year Reich, understood with mathematical certainty that Germany could not win. He did not tell the others. What would be the point? He folded the map. He put it back in his pocket. He looked up at the moon and thought of his mother, and he prayed to a god he was no longer sure existed that Munich might somehow be spared. October, a hot afternoon. Patterson, the citrus foreman, drove Weber and 2 other prisoners into the town of Stark to pick up spare parts for a broken tractor. It was permitted. It happened often. Prisoners under light supervision were a common sight on the streets of small Florida towns in those years. Patterson parked the truck outside a diner on the main street. He said, "Y'all hungry? Come on, I'll buy you boys a Coke." Weber climbed down from the truck. He looked at the diner. There was a sign in the window. It was hand-painted, black letters on white board, weathered at the edges. Only, Weber did not fully understand the American language, but he understood those words. He had seen them in a dozen towns already, on water fountains, on bus benches, on the doors of movie theaters. They walked inside. The bell above the door jingled. A waitress in a pink apron smiled at Patterson, said, "Afternoon, honey," and began pouring coffee before he had even sat down. Weber sat at the counter. He ordered a hamburger. He ordered a Coca-Cola. The waitress smiled at him too and asked in a friendly drawl, "Where you from, sugar?" "Munich," Weber said carefully. "In Germany." The waitress laughed. "Well, ain't that something? You want fries with that sugar?" And then, at that precise moment, the bell above the door jingled again. 2 American soldiers walked in. Their uniforms were spotless. Their boots were polished, their brass gleamed. They wore the shoulder patches of a service unit, stationed at Camp Blanding itself, the very same camp where Weber slept every night. They were black. The waitress's smile disappeared like a candle blown out. "You boys know the rules," she said. The taller of the 2 soldiers, a corporal with 3 chevrons and a good conduct ribbon on his chest, took off his cap. He held it in his hands. He spoke very quietly. "Ma'am," he said, "we just want a cup of coffee. To go. We can drink it outside." "You know where the colored window is," the waitress said. "Around back." The soldier looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Weber, sitting at the counter with a hamburger halfway to his mouth. Their eyes met. And in that instant, Hans Weber, prisoner of war of the Third Reich, a soldier of Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht, understood something that would rearrange the furniture of his soul. He, the enemy, was welcome at the counter. The American in the uniform of the country that was defeating him was not. The black soldier's mouth tightened. He put his cap back on. He turned. He walked out of the diner. His companion followed. The bell above the door jingled a 3rd time and then went still. The waitress topped off Weber's Coca-Cola. "Some folks," she said, shaking her head, "just don't know their place." Weber did not answer. He did not eat the hamburger. He did not touch the Coca-Cola. He sat and stared at his own hands. And he thought about the propaganda leaflets his officers had handed out in Africa, the ones with the crude cartoons of American soldiers as mongrels and race traitors. He had believed those leaflets once. Everyone had. But looking at his own white hands, welcomed here because of their color and not their loyalty, he understood that the leaflets had told a truth Goebbels had never intended. America, he thought, has a wound, and the wound has not healed. Winter came, or what Florida called winter. The oranges turned gold on the trees. The air grew cool at night, and the guards started wearing wool jackets, and in the barracks, something began to rot. Oberleutnant Fischer arrived in November, Fallschirmjäger, paratrooper, Ramka Brigade, veteran of Crete. His face was long and sharp, and his eyes had that flat metallic gleam Weber had seen in True Believers all through the war. Fischer did not smile. Fischer did not swim in the lake. Fischer looked at the wooden barracks and the mess hall and the movies and the oranges, and he saw a betrayal. He began to organize. He called it the Ehrengericht, the Court of Honor. It met in a corner of the barracks after lights out. 6 or 7 men gathered around a single candle. They kept lists. They noted which prisoners spoke English, which prisoners had eaten dinner at the home of an American family, which prisoners had been seen laughing with the guards, which prisoners had, in the whispered judgment of Oberleutnant Fischer, forgotten they were German. Weber's name went on the list. He had by then taught himself to read the Saturday Evening Post. He could hold a simple conversation with Patterson about the price of citrus futures. He had accepted lucky strikes from Matthews on more than a dozen occasions. The visit came on a night in January of 1944. Weber remembered later that the wind had been howling through the pines, and the barracks had smelled of kerosene and boot polish. 4 men. Fischer was not among them. Fischer never dirtied his own hands. They pulled the blanket over Weber's head. They pinned his arms, and they beat him with the wooden legs of a broken stool, his ribs, his back, his kidneys. They took care not to break bones. They took care not to leave marks on his face. This was not murder. This was pedagogy. A voice hissed in his ear, in flawless Prussian German, "Denk daran, wer du bist, remember who you are." Then they were gone. Weber lay in his bunk until dawn, his mouth full of blood, his ribs on fire, and he did not report the beating. To report it would have been to invite worse. To report it would have been to prove Fischer's accusation. He was a German. He would endure. But what Fischer did not know, what none of the Ehrengericht knew, was that 800 miles to the west, in a camp called Papago Park in Arizona, 7 fanatical Kriegsmarine sailors had already dragged a fellow prisoner named Werner Drexler into a shower room and hanged him from a pipe. March 12, 1944. Drexler had been suspected of talking to American interrogators. The Kriegsmarine sailors judged him. The Ehrengericht sentenced him. The rope did the rest. American Army finally understood that the Nazi virus had crossed the Atlantic in the throats of its prisoners, and by late 1944, the Army moved. 4,000 of the hardest, most fanatical POWs in the American system were pulled out of their comfortable camps and shipped, under heavy guard, to a place called Camp Alva in Oklahoma. The prisoners called it the Black Camp, the prison inside the prison. Fisher was on that train. He did not say goodbye. He did not need to. Weber watched the truck pull away in the gray dawn light, and he felt his ribs still tender, and he understood that he had survived a second war within the first. The barracks grew quiet after Fisher left. The candle in the corner stayed dark. Men who had been afraid to speak began speaking again. Men who had hidden their English books beneath their mattresses began reading them openly, and on Christmas Eve of 1944, a knock came at the door of Weber's barrack. It was Patterson. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, his weathered face soft in the lamplight. "Weber," he said, "the wife wants to know if you and 3 of your buddies would come out to the farm for Christmas dinner tomorrow. She's fixing a turkey. She's making pie. She said no man ought to eat mess hall food on Christmas." Weber stared at him. He looked at Hoffman. Hoffman nodded once, slowly. The next afternoon, 4 German prisoners of war, dressed in the cleanest uniforms they owned, climbed into the back of Patterson's pickup truck and rode out to a small farmhouse where a Florida woman named Ruth Patterson's had set a table for 8. There was turkey. There was cornbread. There was sweet potato pie. There were 3 small Patterson children who stared at the Germans with enormous eyes and then, within 20 minutes, were teaching them how to play jacks on the living room floor. After dinner, Mr. Patterson lit a fire. He asked if the Germans knew any Christmas songs. Hoffman began to sing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, and Ruth Patterson at her kitchen sink, wiping a dish, joined in. Silent Night, Holy Night, 2 languages, 1 melody. A Florida farmhouse in the middle of the Second World War. Weber did not weep. He was still too proud to weep. But he set down his coffee cup very slowly, and he closed his eyes, and he let the sound of it wash over him like the warm water of Kingsley Lake. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1945, a Red Cross letter arrived at Camp Blanding. Weber read it standing in the doorway of his barrack, the winter sun pale on his face. Munich, September of 1944. An Allied bombing raid. A basement collapsed. His father, Carl Weber, 61 years old, a bookbinder who had never held a rifle in his life, had died in the rubble of the house next door to their own. And then, further down the same letter, a second line, Eastern Front. March 3, 1945. His younger brother, Klaus, 19 years old, a boy who had once collected butterflies in the Bavarian meadows, had been killed in action somewhere near a village whose name Weber could not pronounce. He folded the letter. He walked back into the barrack. He climbed into his bunk. He turned his face to the wall. He did not show the letter to any man. Outside, the Florida sun kept shining. Outside, the oranges kept ripening on the trees. Outside, a mockingbird sang in a language older than every war ever fought. And Hans Weber lay in his bunk in a wooden barrack in the piney woods of Florida. And he wept at last, for the first time since he had been captured. He wept for his father. He wept for his brother. He wept for the country that had sent them both to die. May 8, 1945, a Tuesday. The news reached Camp Blanding at breakfast, carried by a young American private who ran through the mess hall shouting words. The German prisoners could not understand at first because the words did not seem possible. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The Third Reich, the Thousand-Year Reich, the empire that had swallowed Warsaw and Paris and Athens and the black earth of Ukraine, was gone. It had ended not with a trumpet but with a signature in a schoolhouse in Reims at 2:41 in the morning by a general named Jodl, whose face Weber had once seen on a propaganda poster in Munich. The mess hall went silent. He looked, set down his fork. Hoffman, staring at the table. A young Panzer grenadier from Hamburg, tears sliding silently into his oatmeal. An old Feldwebel from Königsberg, whose city had been taken by the Red Army a month before, closing his eyes and breathing very slowly through his nose. Weber walked outside. The Florida sun was already warm. A mockingbird was singing in a pine tree. The world had not noticed. He sat down on the wooden steps of the barrack, and he thought about his father in the rubble of Munich, and his brother in the frozen earth of some Prussian field, and he understood that he had survived a war his family had not. The guilt of survival is a heavy thing. It does not lift. 3 days later, Life magazine arrived at the camp library. The photographs were on page 32. Buchenwald, the gates, the ovens. The stacks of bodies, arms and legs jutting at impossible angles, faces caved in by starvation until they no longer looked human. American soldiers with handkerchiefs pressed to their mouths, staring at things the camera could barely bring itself to record. The prisoners crowded around the magazine. Some men turned away. Some men wept. Some men said, immediately, "It is a lie. It is Allied propaganda. It cannot be true." Weber said nothing. He looked at the photographs for a long time, because Weber remembered a rumor: Naples, autumn of 1942. A supply officer in transit from the Eastern Front, drunk in a cafe, had spoken of camps somewhere in Poland, trains that went in full and came out empty. Weber had laughed at him. Weber had said, "We are German soldiers, not butchers." Weber had gone back to his ship and forgotten the conversation because forgetting was easier than believing. 3 years later, in a wooden barrack in the piney woods of Florida, Weber sat with a magazine open in his lap and understood that he had been standing on a knife's edge for the whole war, and had chosen every single day not to look down. The uniform he had worn, the oath he had sworn, the medals in his footlocker, they had not built the ovens, but they had guarded the road that led to them. That night, the American colonel who ran Camp Blanding called the prisoners into the mess hall. He stood on a wooden crate. He was a Georgia man, gray at the temples, a veteran of the First War. He spoke through an interpreter, though most of the prisoners had learned enough English to follow along. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will have noticed a change in your rations this week. The United States Congress has ordered us to reduce your food to the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. 2,000 calories a day, no more." He paused. He looked out across the room. "The American people," he said, "have seen what your army did in Poland, in Germany, in the camps. They are angry. They want you to feel some measure of what your countrymen inflicted on the innocent. I am a soldier. I follow orders. But I want you to understand why the beef stew has gone from your table. I want you to understand what you are now, in the eyes of my nation." He stepped down from the crate. He did not shout. He did not accuse. That was the worst part. 2 nights later, a young Waffen-SS corporal from Dresden hanged himself in the latrine with a length of clothesline. He left no note. He needed no note. His war was over. His country was rubble. His grandmother had been in Dresden the night the sky caught fire. Weber helped cut the boy down. He did not know his name. He learned it later. He would not forget it. The camp did not speak of the death. The camp did not speak of much of anything that summer of 1945. Weber worked. Weber ate his reduced rations. Weber lay in his bunk at night and stared at the ceiling and waited for the ships, because the ships would come. Everyone said so. The war was over. The prisoners would go home. Home to Munich. Home to Anna Weber, in her kitchen, humming while she peeled potatoes. Home to whatever was left of the country that had killed his father and his brother, and had failed in the end to kill him. The ship came in March of 1946. Weber climbed the gangway at the port of Jacksonville, Florida, and he did not look back. He did not want to look back. The oranges, the lake, the corporal named Matthews with the Bavarian accent. He put them all in a locked room inside his chest and threw away the key. The Atlantic crossing was calm. 15 days. Weber slept. Weber dreamed of his mother, practiced the word say when he saw her, "I am home, Mama. I am home. I am sorry for everything." The ship docked at Le Havre, not Cherbourg, not Hamburg, not Bremerhaven. Le Havre, in France. Weber stood on the deck and looked at the shattered French port, and he watched French gendarmes marching along the pier with rifles slung. And he understood in the pit of his stomach that something had gone terribly wrong. An American officer stood at the top of the gangway. He read from a clipboard. He read in a bored, flat voice. "By agreement between the government of the United States and the provisional government of the French Republic," the officer said, "the following prisoners of war are transferred to French custody for a period of labor service to assist in the reconstruction of infrastructure damaged during the war. This transfer is authorized under Article." Weber did not hear the rest. He was one of 740,000 German prisoners held by the Americans, loaned like tools to the French, like plow horses to a neighbor, coal mines, railway beds, bridges, roads. The Vatican would protest. The Red Cross would protest. The letters would sit in filing cabinets in Washington while Weber, in a French mining town whose name he could not pronounce, swung a pickaxe 12 hours a day for a bowl of watery soup. He was held until the end of 1947, 21 months. He did not swim in any lakes. No one offered him a lucky strike. No American mother invited him for Christmas dinner. The French guards were not cruel. Exactly. They were something worse. They were indifferent. Their villages had been burned. Their brothers had been shot in ditches. Weber understood. But some nights, lying on a straw pallet in a barracks that smelled of coal dust and lice, Weber thought about Florida, and he tasted something bitter in the back of his throat that he could not name for a long time. He named it at last one November evening in 1946. Betrayal. Florida had been a lie. Not a lie, the Americans told him. A lie he had told himself. He had believed for a little while in the goodness of the American century, and now the American century had handed him to the French like a bag of coal and gone home to its baseball games and its Coca-Cola. He did not blame Matthews. He did not blame Patterson. He blamed something larger and colder that lived above them all, and had signed the papers and had gone to bed. He came home to Munich in the first week of February, 1948. The train pulled into what was left of the Hauptbahnhof, a skeleton of iron with no roof, and Weber walked out into a city that no longer existed. Whole blocks were gone. Whole streets were gone. The cathedral rose above the ruins like a broken tooth. Women in headscarves picked through rubble with their bare hands, looking for bricks that could be sold, for pipes that could be traded, for anything that had once been part of a home. Weber walked for 4 hours. He found the house on Schellingstrasse. The house was not there. Where the house had been was a cellar, and a set of concrete steps leading down into it, and a chimney of white smoke rising from a stovepipe that stuck out of a hole in the ground. Weber walked down the steps. Anna Weber was sitting on a wooden crate, wrapped in a coat that had once been his father's. She was 52 years old. She looked 70. Her hair was white. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had spent 3 winters trading turnips for coal. She looked up. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stood very slowly, and she walked to her son and she put her hand on his cheek, and she said one word, hands. Weber went to his knees on the cellar floor and pressed his face into his mother's coat, and for the second time in his life he wept. And Anna Weber stroked his hair and hummed a song she had hummed when he was 3 years old. And outside the cellar, the American occupation soldiers were trading Lucky Strike cigarettes for German silverware at the going rate of 4 cigarettes per spoon. Weber lifted his head. He saw the packet on the crate beside his mother's kettle. Lucky Strike, red circle, white paper. He thought of a Florida orange grove. He thought of a young corporal named Matthews, striking a match against the Bavarian breeze. He thought of the whole vanished world of Camp Blanding, and he understood that it had followed him home in the smoke of a single cigarette. He picked up the pack. He held it in his hand. He did not smoke. He put it back down. Weber built his life back the way he had learned to build a factory in Winter Haven. 1 block, 1 trowel of mortar, 1 pipe joint at a time. He worked on the rubble crews. He knew concrete. He knew plumbing. He knew how to read a blueprint. American engineers running the reconstruction paid him in cigarettes and canned meat. And by 1949, he had saved enough to marry a young widow named Gertrude, whose first husband had died at Stalingrad and whose eyes held a sorrow older than the century. They had 3 children, a boy in 1950, a second boy in 1955. In the summer of 1955, Weber opened a small construction company. 2 employees, a used truck, a room above a bakery that served as the office. Over the next 30 years, he would build houses and schools and a small church in a suburb of Munich. He never grew rich. He grew steady. He grew respected. He never returned to America. He never wrote to Matthews. He never spoke of Camp Blanding, not to Gertrude, not to his children, not even to his priest. But in the bottom drawer of the walnut desk in his study, beneath a folder of tax records and an expired passport, he kept a single photograph. A postcard, really. He had bought it in Stark in the winter of 1944, Kingsley Lake, a blue circle of Florida water in the middle of a pine forest. His grandchildren, poking through the drawer one summer afternoon in 1985, found the postcard and asked him what it was. Weber took the postcard from their small hands. He looked at it for a long time. "A place I went swimming once," he said. That was all. He put it back in the drawer. He died in Munich on the 7th of October, 1987, 68 years old. A heart attack, quick and clean, at his kitchen table with a cup of morning coffee in his hand. His widow found the postcard when she cleaned out the desk. She did not know what it meant. She put it in a shoebox with the rest of the photograph. The shoebox is still somewhere in Munich, in the possession of a grandchild who never knew about the orange groves. The story you have just heard is a work of narrative fiction. Hans Weber is a composite character, drawn from the real published memoirs of former German prisoners of war who lived through the American camps in the 1940s. Reinhold Pabel, whose book Enemies Are Human was published in 1955. Georg Gärtner, whose book Hitler's Last Soldier in America appeared in 1985. And from the documented records of the Camp Blanding Museum in Stark, Florida, where the barracks stood, and where a small exhibit still preserves the memory of the men who once picked oranges beneath its pines. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held approximately 371,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. It fed them, it paid them, it sent some of them swimming in Florida lakes. At the very same time, this same nation forcibly relocated 120,000 Japanese-American citizens, most of them born in the United States, into barbed wire internment camps in the deserts of California, Arizona, Wyoming, and Idaho. Hitler's soldiers ate turkey at American kitchen tables. American citizens, guilty of nothing but the shape of their eyes, lost their homes and their farms and their businesses, and in many cases, everything they had ever built. That is not an argument, that is a fact. Between 5,000 and 10,000 former German prisoners of war returned to the United States as immigrants in the years after the war. They came back to Florida, they came back to Oklahoma, they came back to Iowa. They opened bakeries and repair shops and construction companies. They married American women. They raised American children. Hans Weber was not one of them. He kept his postcard in a drawer and he died in the city where he was born. And he took his silence with him into the ground. But somewhere in America tonight, an old man is sitting on a porch, looking out at a Florida sunset, remembering an accent he last heard when he was 23 years old. And somewhere in Germany tonight, a grandchild is opening a shoebox. And the question the century never answered still hangs in the warm American air. Who deserves to be seen as human in a time of war? And who decides